This is the Horse Radio Network.
This is episode 70 of the Wisdom by WESA show on the Horse Radio Network. This is Mike Donnell.
I'm Casey Wilbanks-Coletti.
And this is Sophia Gena. Welcome to Wisdom by WESA on the Horse Radio Network.
This podcast is brought to you by the Western and English Sales Association, WESA, which provides the world's largest trade events for retailers, manufacturers, and sales representatives of the equestrian industry. In this podcast, we feature exclusive interviews with noteworthy Western and English personalities, retailers, and exhibitors who you've always wanted to talk to. Don't miss out on all the news for manufacturers and retailers in the equine industry. Today, we are finishing the mini-series featuring past WESA or WESA presidents, and a lot of the presidents have mentioned Tony High, the former executive director.
That's right. And actually, while Kristen and Amy have gone through all of the WESA materials to gather more information about WESA's timeline for us, we also found a great editorial piece that Tony had worked on together with the team at Tack and Talks for the 75th anniversary.
What are some of the highlights?
Well, when WESA celebrated the 75th anniversary in 1997, the focus was on both tradition and growth. And both of these elements are, of course, still important to the association today. But it's also mentioned that the WESA trade show had become one of the nation's premier equestrian and Western events through the 60s and 70s, and the largest show of its kind. And in his interview, Bug Anderson recalled having some great performers at the WESA trade show, and this editorial piece picked up on that, as well as buyers and exhibitors were entertained by Garth Brooks in 1991, Clay Walker in 1993, and Tracy Lawrence in 1995, for example. So that's pretty special.
Big headliners for sure. Were there any predictions made back then that were fulfilled or not fulfilled in the 25 years following that article?
Yes, so Tony forecasted some significant changes and actually a venue expansion, which we did go through by rebranding and also finding a new home. And then some other examples that Tony mentioned were a rise in international attendance with a focus on global marketing strategies. And that also became a reality because WESA actually does advertise the trade show all over the world, and we do welcome a diverse group of buyers and exhibitors. And then technology was predicted to make a big impact as well. She forecasted computer chip catalogs for our 100th anniversary and some virtual rodeos and exhibit spaces. And of course, the directory is available online, and so are the exhibitors' product catalogs. But I think more interestingly, we did have some virtual rodeos recently, not really at the trade show, but of course, due to the pandemic, lots of things were hosted virtually throughout the past year. So yeah, that's some interesting predictions, and we are excited to see what the next years have in store for all of us. Hopefully another 100 years and for generations to come.
Scott Piper's first job after graduating from the University of Arizona was playing wide receiver in the NFL, first for the Atlanta Falcons and then the Denver Broncos. After retiring due to injury, Piper started a consulting business with a Western boot company as one of his clients. He later joined that company and started a new career in the Western industry, including a term as president of WESA, and we're so happy to have Scott join us today. Our listeners who are also interested in dressage should be sure to catch the weekly episodes of the Dressage Radio Show on the Horse Radio Network, which is the official podcast of the United States Dressage Federation. The show is hosted by two accomplished Grand Prix riders, Reese Koffler Stanfield, United States Dressage Federation bronze, silver, and gold medalist, and Philip Parks, who began riding at an early age and currently works with experienced and beginning dressage riders in Canada as a trainer and a coach. Scott Piper, thanks so much for joining us on the Wisdom by WESA show.
Mike, my pleasure.
I tell you, it's very interesting to see the routes that people take to join the Western industry and matriculate on to the WESA board and as president of the organization. Last week the last show we had Mark Broughton on. He grew up as a teenage body surfer in L.A. Then he went to Utah to become a ski instructor. Then he went to the Northwest to become a construction worker, started a saddle making class, and the rest was WESA history. In your case, you grew up in Lakewood playing sports, had an outstanding high school career. University of Arizona recruited you, and you played there and came out to play in the NFL. I would guess that while you were going through high school and college, a career in the Western world and as president of WESA was not on your horizon.
You know what, Mike? There wasn't a whole lot of things on my horizon at that time. I just was kind of focused on being. I was kind of focused on being a teenager, and and football. Of course, sports was big in my life, and football and baseball, and I was just trying to get on to 17, get to be 18, 18, get to be 19, right? So life just took the turns it took, and I was very fortunate, and I got a nice offer to go to the University of Arizona, and then out of the University of Arizona, I got approached by the Buffalo Bills, got drafted. So I was very fortunate in that regard. But to answer your question, no, I didn't have a particular focus of being in the Western industry at that time.
However, I think you mentioned to me you did have a love of the horses.
Always loved horses. Of course, I grew up in an era, as did Mark Broughton and maybe a couple other people you might have talked to. But back when the Western TV programs were just big, things like Lone Ranger and Gunsmoke and things of that nature that's what we watched every week, Bonanza. But that lifestyle was just ingrained in us when we were young kids. I grew up in suburban Denver, and I'd walk to school, and I'd always make a little byway, a little path to go by the only pasture I knew of, so I'd go and feed a horse and just hand him some grass or hay or something on the way to school. And always wanted to be, that was just what I wanted to be. But my parents we didn't have horses growing up, so I made an effort to go and see them when I was young. And I remember the first time I begged my parents for my first pair of cowboy boots when I was about 12 years old, 13 years old. It was a pair of Acme Rough Out boots. I just begged them for them. I think they cost a total of like $35, $40 way back then. But it was just one of those lifestyles that were just ingrained in us, and it was just kind of Americana. So, yeah. That's what
well, I think, Casey, you had some of the same experiences growing up, right?
It's kind of funny. Well, just specifically speaking of boots, my first pair of boots were a pair of red cowboy boots, and I used to kiss them and hug them and take them to bed with me. And that was before I think I even knew that that Western industry would be such a huge part of my life. But great build-up and introduction from Mike. For you, Scott, it's a pleasure to have you here and talk with you today. I'm specifically interested in knowing, back at the time when you served as president, if you recall some of the biggest challenges maybe at that time.
Well, back when I was president, we obviously the biggest challenge we all have is to put on the best market, the industry market that we possibly can to represent our industry as well as we can. And so that's kind of our focus. But for me, my biggest challenge, I think, initially was we got my first January as president. We had a little issue at the Denver market where we, at that time, had our markets and our shows. We had a fire, and when I came in the morning, I got called early morning by our staff that I better get down there, and the fire department had been there and what have you. It did not cause the show to not go on, but what it did is brought to my attention, and I brought it to the board of directors' attention, is that did we have a plan? What kind of plan did we have if something happened to our facility? How could we? The challenge was, where would we go and how would we approach that if part or any of that building were to be destroyed or damaged in some way? So that was kind of the challenge I put on the board of directors at that time. So that was my biggest challenge. I was more concerned about what would happen if something happened to our facility where we
Sure.
produce our show.
Sure. And I mean, I can't help but to mention playing in the NFL obviously would take more than just athleticism, but to be a professional athlete at that level, great strength, motivation, stick-to-itiveness, so many other qualities, obviously. But I would just love to know if there was any crossover in maybe things you learned and who you were, and that gave you the ability to play in the NFL that crossed over to be an effective leader for WESA.
Geez, that's might be a little bit of a stretch there, but I think just the focus, I mean, to do anything well and to be good at anything, I think you need a degree of stick-to-itiveness, if you will, and focus, a desire to do it the best of your ability. And I would say that would be true for most everybody I worked with on the board of directors at WESA as well, that everybody wanted to see our industry be the best it could be, wanted to see it prosper, wanted to see it thrive. And I think the people on that board, I think myself included, but just all had this desire for the best. And
Sure.
I think that would be true in football as well. You get to a certain level, you just say, I just want to be a little bit better, and I want to do this the best as I can. So
I'd like to backtrack just a little bit if we could now. You're in the NFL. I think you mentioned your career ended basically because of injuries. You started a consulting business. And as I recall our conversation, your business introduction to the Western world came because you had a bootmaker as a client. And from there, you transitioned into the industry. Maybe you could follow us or take us along that track a little bit.
Yeah, I came out of football and I went into the oil industry. The oil industry was pretty prominent in the Denver market at that time in the early mid '80s. But if you all remember back then, I don't know everybody's age, but if you all remember, the oil industry kind of crashed in the mid '80s, and well, unfortunately, so did my job. So I went to work with a friend of mine who had a sales consulting company. We kind of became partners in it. And our first client, the first client that he brought to me was Tony Lama Boot Company. And Tony Lama, at the time, had suffered a great deal of business loss in the Rocky Mountains. And I think as a result, or I know as a result of the oil industry crash, a lot of oil people, they live a Western type of a lifestyle. And so when they vacated the Denver market in the Denver area, well, business and the Western business certainly suffered a little bit, as well as a lot of other businesses. So Tony Lama, as a company, made a decision, which probably wasn't the best decision, but they decided they'd open up their own retail stores in the Denver market. That was kind of a first at the time for manufacturers. And they opened up 4 retail stores in the Denver market. Well, what that created was a real bad just relationship between Tony Lama and its existing retailers. And so they hired me to come up here and figure out a way to regain the market share that they were losing because all their other retailers were starting to drop them as a result of Tony Lama competing against them. So I came up, I made my suggestions to Tony Lama, to the company. Within a short, about 6 months of me working there, they sold to Justin Industries. Justin Brands bought Tony Lama. I got a call from the president of Justin, and he said, "Scott, do you think that we need to move these? What do you think we need to do with these retail stores?" And I suggested to them that they close them. And he says, "Well, you head out tomorrow morning and close them." So that was my entry into the Western business. I went into the stores. I closed the stores. When I got done closing the stores, I called back the president at the time of Justin, Frank Scavetti, and then he offered me a job. He said, "Well, you've done so much for us to this point. Would you like to have a permanent job with us?" And I knew the history of Tony Lama. Again, I loved just the whole Western lifestyle, so I jumped on that opportunity, and that was 1989. So it's been quite a ride.
I would guess that your first introduction to the industry, closing retail stores, had Must have been a tough thing to do.
Oh, it was awful. It was absolutely awful. But, I for the survival, quite frankly, and I guess when you say survival, the Lama family still had to did sell the company. I don't know if they had to or not, but they sold the company eventually anyway. But it was the damage that those retail stores had done to the relationship they had with all their existing retailers at that point was pretty significant. So, it was tough. It was difficult to go in and tell people you were letting them go. But at the same time, I think it was a step forward for Tony Lama, that brand and that label. We were able to go back out and recreate relationships. We did have to repair some burnt bridges, and that was kind of left up to me as well, because I took the job, but I was to a degree a little bit of a hero in town because I got those stores closed, and we reestablished relationships in the Tony Lama company, and they still are thriving today. They did very well, and they came back very strong and are thriving today. But it was difficult. I would admit that.
So take us through your career, the high spots between then and now.
Well, with Tony Lama, I started out that way. About 5 years in with Tony Lama, with a customer of mine, I designed a couple boots. We came up with a couple styles that for his particular store out in Kansas, and they were very successful. So Tony Lama asked me to join their design team at that time. And I came in with about 4 of us who were on the design team, and the TLX product, the Tony Lama Extreme product, which is their first rubber outsole, I kind of initiated that. So that was kind of a high point there. That's still a very strong product for the Tony Lama Boot Company. Back in 2005, a gentleman named Bob Frazier, who had been past president of Justin Brands, and David Baker, who was a past president of Tony Lama, they kind of joined together and wanted to start the Twisted X Boot Company. And so they called me and asked me if I would join them in that endeavor to launch that. So that was also a highlight. That was to start a company from scratch and establish it. And of course, Twisted X grew in leaps and bounds in the last 10 years. And those are probably the biggest highlights. But the opportunity to get to design and actually see some of your product on the feet of people walking around. I've been in Delaware. I've been in Delaware and was in a store in Delaware one time, and my wife and I looked down, and a gentleman was wearing a pair of boots that I had designed. So that's kind of fun. That's the fun part of the business too. So.
Well, and clearly that background helped when you joined the board of WESA, and as you became president, having been through those various phases from closing retail stores to designing Western products to watching mergers take place. It would seem to me that kind of background was a big help in terms of giving you perspective. But how did you get in on the WESA board? How did all that happen?
Well, Tony High, who is in charge of the office and kind of ran our offices, and she had asked me. She said, "Scott, we could use you on the board of directors." And I said, "Well, Tony, right at that point in time, this is back in the early '90s, I guess, mid '90s." And I told her at the time, frankly, I was just more interested in focusing on my career. But she had asked me, and so I ran for the board of directors, and I didn't get on. I didn't get voted in. And so that was kind of a little bit of a knock. And the following year, she asked me to run again, and I told her I couldn't. I'm not sure if I could take any more of this abuse. But I ran again, and once again, I didn't get voted in. But I was the highest vote getter after the last person. And then we had a gentleman who retired or had to step down, and they called me up and said, "Scott, you're on the board of directors." So I came on, and I really did come on with the intention of, everybody needs to put in some time and help. If we're going to make this thing work, everybody has to have something in it. And I just felt an obligation that I needed to get on the board of directors for the minimum 2, maybe 4 years. And I came on, and 18 years later, I was the president of that. So it lasted a little longer than I had anticipated. But I think just like anybody else, when I got on the board, my eyes were opened exactly what WESA did, what WESA and the board of directors and the organization did for the industry and really did for our careers. The strength that brought the purpose we had and just building the best trade show and promoting our industry the best we could. And my eyes were open, and I just felt like, this was something that was necessary to do. And so I just stayed with it. And again, like you said, I worked my way through the seats and became president of WESA. And that was a joy. And I appreciated everybody I worked with and respect everybody I worked with.
Well, Casey came up in the rodeo world where determination really helps define, and her husband as well, really helps define
Right.
whether you succeed or you don't. Casey, you might comment on that from from your perspective and the importance in the whole Western world of being determined to make progress.
I think determined would be a good word, maybe not just to describe me or my husband or Scott, but I think anybody in this industry. It seems as if the Western industry sometimes tends to be a little bit behind, say, mainstream fashion or kind of anything in the world, to be honest with you. And I think a lot of us that have stayed hooked for so many years and have such a deep love for the industry have been determined to see it succeed. And we have a passion to help it grow. And I think once you're in the industry, and you, Mike, as well, coming from outside of the industry and now in, you've been dedicated for so many years, each in our own way, to continuing to grow the industry.
Mm-hmm. I agree, Casey, and I'll tell you, I think the Western industry, in my opinion, and I've shared this numerous times with other people, I really believe it's the last bastion of really true Americana. I mean, when you go to Europe or you go to Asia or anywhere like that, if somebody wants to look like an American, they're wearing a pair of boots, a pair of jeans, and sometimes even a cowboy hat.
Sure.
And so when people think of America and they think of us, a lot of times it's the American cowboy and just what that brings. I mean, the strength that brings, the image it brings, I think is incomparable. And I want to see that exist. And I want to see it thrive.
And I mean, obviously I may be a little bit biased, but I think rightfully so. I think the people that accumulatively make up our industry, and I'm talking about rodeo, I'm talking about, say, the fashion end of it, all aspects of our industry. I just really believe we're very true to our roots, our values, our morals, and accumulatively as a group of people, I couldn't ask to be part of a better group of people in our world, to be honest.
Right. The fashion industry changes so frequently, and it even does a little bit in the Western business, but it's still pretty stable. It's got a true foundation in it. And I mean, Twisted X kind of led the way in this latest craze, and we call them the casual footwear market. But but still, the basic sense and the basic tradition of the American cowboy has still always been true in Western fashion, where the other fashion areas, they go so far off the wall, so just go crazy, and we have a tendency to go that way sometimes. Western always really does stay true, essentially, to its roots.
Yeah. It's like a good turquoise necklace will never go out of style. Ever.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Yeah, or a basic black cowboy boot.
A
nice dress cowboy, but it'll always be that way.
That's right. Some of the most successful businessmen in the world that have nothing to do with the Western industry will have a nice pair of cowboy boots, and I think that's pretty cool. Absolutely, it says a lot. Yeah. But you kind of mentioned. Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead. Go. No, you go ahead, Case.
You kind of mentioned this. You hit on this just a little bit in this last conversation we just had. But what do you wish for or see in WESA's future?
I see it just remaining. Everything changes, and I think as an organization, it was very difficult in this last couple of years where we were moving what had been our home for a number of years out of Denver and moving our show to Dallas. And there's a number of reasons for that. And there's a number, and we don't need to get into all that, but change is inevitable. And I think as long as you adapt to those changes, but you stay focused on what you came to the dance with and what you came to the dance for. And WESA has always been behind the survival and of the Western industry. And I believe that, all those changes are going to be good. I think WESA is just going to grow stronger. I think our industry is going to grow stronger. I think we're kind of in a funky kind of a place right now as a nation, but I think the American cowboy is always consistent, and I think what goes around comes around. And I think that the Western lifestyle is only going to get more popular in the years to come.
Well, I think that is a great place to let you go on about the rest of your day and your business. Well, it's been great getting your perspective on how the industry can go and where it can go. But also, I've always enjoyed in talking with the past presidents, their personal histories as how they got in the business, how they got to WESA, their leadership challenges. And I think those all reflect what you and Casey have been talking about in terms of the strength and the dominance of the Western ethics and Western lifestyle. And I want to thank you very much for taking the time to be on our show.
Well, thank you, guys. I appreciate the time, and it certainly was a pleasure talking to you.
Show notes and links from today's show can be found at the website wisdombywesa.com. And of course, we'd love to hear your feedback. There is a contact link on the website.
The Wisdom by WESA show will be published on the 15th and 30th of every month. You can listen on most of your favorite podcast players, and you can also listen on the Horse Radio Network app on your iOS or Android phone. You just search Horse Radio Network in the App Store. It's free and super easy to use. Be sure to visit all the great shows on the Horse Radio Network at horseradionetwork.com. Thanks for listening to the Wisdom by WESA podcast. WESA, where the industry meets.